Welcome, I'm Matt Smith. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Global Entrepreneurship Network. Delighted to be hosting the launch of the 6th Missing Entrepreneurs report, published by the OECD and the European Commission. We have got quite a lineup of speakers over the next 75 minutes. I'm conscious that I do not want to run over. I want to respect your time, so we'll be finishing bang on 1:15 European. I will hand straight over to our first speaker, which is Joost Korte, Director General of DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission. Hopefully, okay, over to you. Oh, sorry, Joost, you're muted.
Here we go. Now you can hear me. Okay, excellent. Thanks a lot, Matt. And dear participant, dear Lamia, first of all, it's a real pleasure for me to be here this afternoon to open this event that's dedicated to the what is already the 6th edition of the Missing Entrepreneurs Report, the Missing Entrepreneurs Report 2021. And let me start by saying how happy we are from the side of the European Commission to be able to work with the OECD on these important reports, and in particular, of course, with Lamia's department. I mean, the event marks the end, in fact, of a 2-year research on the conditions under which specific target groups could thrive better as entrepreneurs. And I think the message from the report is very, very clear. It has shown over the many years that this report is being done, that the awareness of the importance of this group, the missing entrepreneurs, and the potential that they have has grown a lot. And not only has the awareness grown a lot, I think we also now realize a lot better that it is not a good idea to waste that potential. We need them. We need these so-called missing entrepreneurs to keep our social welfare state in a good state. They should not be wasted. In my intervention, let me focus on 2 points. First of all, the main findings of the report, and secondly, the kind of policy responses that have been so helpfully inventorized in the report from the different member states to support this kind of entrepreneurship. First of all, I mean, I said the report is really an eye-opener for all of us for at least 2 reasons. First of all, it demonstrates that putting in place effective, inclusive entrepreneurship policies and expanding entrepreneurship really helps to create jobs, to fight social and financial exclusion, to leverage technologies, and to help respond to economic challenges. Secondly, the report also confirms very strongly that the creation of businesses is not accessible to everyone under the same conditions. Women, young people, and migrants face specific and often much greater hurdles on the path to entrepreneurship, as do people with disabilities, seniors, or the unemployed. Nevertheless, major progress has been achieved during the past decades. We see member states putting in place targeted support programs, and mentoring and training schemes are now offered in almost all EU member states. Above all, it seems, as I said just before, that the awareness of the problem has grown. I'm therefore happy that the European Commission has been able to support this important project, and I suggest that we continue. Now, if we look at the 3 key findings of the report, the first, I think, is that we see that about 3/4 of these missing entrepreneurs are women. This shows that policies around gender equality are certainly not a luxury. Secondly, we also see that young people, in fact, create fewer businesses, at least in the European Union, than those that are over 50 years old. We need, therefore, to do much more to support young people in realizing their entrepreneurial potential. And I'm very happy also to see that the European Commission proposed that next year, 2022, should be the year of the youth. Thirdly, the report also finds, and this is probably the most important finding, that within the category of self-employed, it appears that our target groups These are women, youth, senior migrants have been hit particularly hard by COVID-19. They have already been really seriously impacted by the consequences of the COVID-19 crisis. So those are, I think, the main findings that we should discuss in the seminar today. If we then go to the policy responses, now it's interesting to note that the OECD and the Commission have jointly developed the so-called Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool, by which policymakers or stakeholders can describe a specific economic environment and automatically receive the assessment of this environment under the inclusive and social angle. The tool helps also to find relevant material and inspiring case studies to make their entrepreneurship policies more inclusive and social. In addition, we need to ensure that we have the right safety nets in place to support the self-employed, in particular women, young people, senior people, and migrants. In 2019, the Council of the European Union adopted a recommendation which is called Access to Social Protection for All. And the analysis, in fact, underlying that recommendation fully confirms also the findings of the report, which is that access for self-employed, notably, to these social protection schemes are pretty essential also for the general climate of entrepreneurship in a country. And we do see that countries that have in place strong protection systems do actually quite a lot better in terms of innovation and in terms of entrepreneurship more broadly. And I think COVID-19, as the report says, has shown how difficult it actually is for self-employed from the category that we're talking about today to get access to those schemes. We are monitoring the implementation of this Council recommendation, and since May 2021, almost all member states have now submitted their national plans. Also, the forthcoming proposal of the European Commission on platform work, which would normally come next week, will also ensure that we keep the innovative spirit of platforms going, while of course also safeguarding the rights of the people that are working through the platform economy. An important number of people are today interested in entrepreneurship with purpose and driven by values, especially among the young people. There is a true desire in our societies for economic activities for the common good, enshrined also very strongly in the green transition. From Brussels, we observe that social entrepreneurship is raising the attention of many aspiring entrepreneurs. We are considering this interest seriously at the Commission. And this is one of the reasons why Commissioner Nicola Schmid will put to the College of Commissioners again next week on the 8th of December, an action plan for the social economy, for which we will also organize an important conference on the 16th of December, which you may want to link up to. In this social economy action plan, the Commission will put forward concrete measures to unlock the potential of social enterprises. This requires developing enabling policies and also legal frameworks in specific areas, such as state aid, public procurement, and also taxation. The action plan will seek to mobilize all relevant stakeholders around this objective, including at national, regional, and international levels. Entrepreneurship support, in particular for youth and women, will be part of the implementation of the plan. And in 2022, we will launch a series of international capacity building events to promote, again, young entrepreneurship, also as part of the Year of the Youth. So let me then conclude. We need clearly innovative solutions to address the challenging times brought by the green, the digital, and demographic transitions. Entrepreneurship can play a key role in this. I was struck also by the foreword that Lamia wrote, where she said to the report that in fact, COVID-19 doesn't actually change the megatrends. The megatrends are there, but what it did do very strongly, it made a lot clearer what the fragilities and where the weaknesses are. And that is the value in a way of COVID-19, and that also is a clear message to all the policymakers to work on those mechanisms. The report shows that with the right incentives, there could be potentially an additional 9 million people starting and managing new businesses in the European Union. We cannot miss this opportunity, both for our economy and for making our society more inclusive and fair. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to an interesting discussion.
Thank you, Joost. Next up, we have Lamia Kamal-Chaoui, Director of Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities at the OECD. Let's get you up on screen.
Thank you very much, Director General Joost Korte. Dear Jonathan Ortmans, very nice to see you again after such a long time. Distinguished speakers, dear participants, thank you all for joining us for the launch of the 6th edition of the OECD-EU Missing Entrepreneurs series. This report could not have come at a better time because entrepreneurs are indeed under huge pressure. During the pandemic, more than 40% of new ventures needed to urgently raise capital to survive, and actually many did not survive. The self-employed were about 1.6 times more likely than employees to become unemployed in 2020. And these pressures fell disproportionately on some groups of entrepreneurs who were actually already suffering from unequal opportunities, this long-standing issues, our missing entrepreneurs. And for example, business closure rates were 30 to 50% higher for women-operated businesses in the first half of 2020 in most regions of the world, not just in the EU, almost everywhere in the planet. So this report is really timely because our missing entrepreneurs need us. It is also timely because we need them. We need these entrepreneurs to create new ideas, new business models, and new jobs to drive the recovery. We know the entrepreneurial spirit is still very much alive. While business creations actually fell early in the pandemic, these have bounced back strongly. And indeed, most countries actually, they saw startup rises in 2020 compared to 2019. And our challenge now is to ensure that this revival that we are observing in entrepreneurship is broad and inclusive. And unfortunately, that has not always been the case, as Joost just mentioned. Today's report showed that if everyone was active in business creation as 30, 49-year-old men, there will be 35 million more across the OECD, 9 million more specifically in the EU. So this is quite huge. And these missing entrepreneurs represent, of course, a lost opportunity for us all. They represent 35 million missed opportunities to boost productivity and 35 million missed opportunities for people to make a better life for themselves and for their families. So who are these missing entrepreneurs? Well, 3/4 of these missing entrepreneurs are women, half are over 50 years old, and 1 in 8 are under 30 years old. Overall, we have observed, and this is good news, some progress. Their number actually declined slightly over the past decade, but the gaps remain too large. Even in better performing countries, for instance, that like the Netherlands, where there are still 250,000 missing entrepreneurs. So the barrier faced by our 35 million missing entrepreneurs, actually they are not so different from those faced by other entrepreneurs. They include, of course, a lack of finance, lack of skills, and a lack of networks. But the scale of this issue is much more greater. And the good news is that there are many inspiring examples of countries really taking actions to address these challenges. And we have reported these inspiring examples in the report that we're launching today. And we took them also from the online OECD European Union Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool, which is an online policy assessment tool which provides guidance, notes, and case studies to help promote inclusive and social entrepreneurship. I invite you to have a look on the website, and because it's also available in 24 languages. Let me now set up some of the findings for some specific groups. Of course, I will start with the largest group, the 26 million missing female entrepreneurs. Despite a high education level and strong labor market participation, less than 5% of women in the EU were creating and managing businesses between 2016 and 2020, compared to 8% of men, 5 versus 8. And we see a similar gap across OECD countries more broadly. Gender gaps actually reflect barriers in financial markets, skills gaps, negative social attitudes, and a lack of suitable maternity and childcare support. And for example, women are only 75% as likely as men in OECD and EU countries to report having the skills needed to start a business. And many countries actually, they have been supporting women entrepreneurs, and we are seeing more and more countries doing so, but often leave gaps in the support system. And here I'd like to mention as an example, the Canada's Women Entrepreneurship Strategy, the WES, which I think provides an inspiring example. It looks across the entire entrepreneurial ecosystem to deliver financial support, improve access to networks and advice, and sponsor research. This coordinated approach not only tackles financial barriers, but also tackles head-on long-standing issues of gender bias among entrepreneurship support organizations. Let me now turn to our young entrepreneurs. I was talking about women. Now let's talk about the young entrepreneurs. Young people, of course, often have a higher level of entrepreneurial intentions. Nearly half of university students, actually globally, they intend to start a business within 5 years of graduation. But yet, only 5% of youth aged between 18 to 30 in the EU and 8% in the OECD are effectively engaging, actively working on a startup. One of the reasons is that people under 30 years old are about 85% as likely as those over 50 years old to feel they have the skills and knowledge to start a business. So they have less confidence in doing so. Addressing this gap is even more important today, given the sharp increases in youth employment across the EU and OECD areas since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. To address the urgency of action on youth, actually at the OECD, in our 2021 Ministerial Council meeting, which just took place a couple of months ago, ministers called for an OECD recommendation to support young people, which will include measures to promote youth entrepreneurship. And the report we are launching today includes many positive examples of public action to inform the recommendation. One example is the National Youth Entrepreneurship Program in Hungary, which has supported 6,500 youth to create businesses since 2014. The program offers young people training, mentoring, and business counseling and financial support as a second step. So beyond women and the young, our report, of course, also covers key issues facing immigrants, seniors, the unemployed, and people with disability. For this group, targeted program needs to be scaled up and reflect learning about what works. Mainstreaming entrepreneurship program can also do more by reconsidering selection criteria, which often discourage application from underrepresented groups, and increasing diversity among trainers, coaches, and business advisors to make support more sensitive to diverse needs. Finally, there is a need to tackle broader barriers, such as the way that some benefit systems withdraw support when even a small amount of income is earned, reducing incentive to set up a business. This is not new. This is something that we have been talking about for a long time. So ladies and gentlemen, Let me now leave you with just three major recommendations from the Missing Entrepreneurs report. First, we need to expand access to microfinance. Microfinance has been growing strongly, and women have been the main beneficiary, accounting for nearly 60% of borrowers in Europe. However, there is, of course, much more to do, and mid-demand for microfinance in the EU alone is about 40 billion euro per year, and many schemes have been put under pressure by the pandemic. Second, our missing entrepreneurs need support to develop the right management, financial, digital, and technical skills. And here, an individualized approach to learning through coaches and mentors carefully matched from a similar background can really have a great impact. Tailored support of these kinds tend to have, we have seen that, higher take-up rates, higher satisfaction level, and more positive outcomes than general entrepreneurship support schemes. And finally, governments need to continue to improve framework conditions to provide the right incentive and lift broader barrier. For example, many governments, such as in Hungary and Spain, have put in place welfare bridges, which allow an individual to keep receiving employment insurance payments while they set up their own enterprises, or other countries like Germany and the Slovak Republic are improving childcare options for women entrepreneurs. I would like to stop here and take the opportunity to thank the European Commission for this long partnership, Joost, of course, but also Anne Branch, Julien De Beers, and Guy Lejeune. And please allow me also to thank my team, Jonathan Ortmans and David Hamiliski, that have been starting this for a long time, as well as Céline Kaufman and Karen Maguire. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And now we'll hear briefly from Jonathan Ortmans, President of the Global Entrepreneurship Network.
Great. Well, thank you so much indeed, Joost and Lamia. It is very exciting for those of us in the NGO nonprofit community to be able to, hold on, I think, Mike.
We're hearing you but not seeing you, Jonathan, but if you'd like to continue. Oh, there we go.
All right, fantastic. Sorry about that. So many thanks and congratulations to the OECD and to the EU. This is so exciting for those of us that have been in the field of entrepreneurship advocacy for some time, particularly on the policymaker level, to see such a deep understanding of the importance of entrepreneurship more broadly to building our economies and expanding opportunity. And every year, that level of sophistication among policymakers seems to be advanced. So I want to start by agreeing with the very first comment made, I think, this morning, that I think we should be optimistic that the level of awareness is indeed increasing. At the Global Entrepreneurship Network, of course, we operate in 200 countries. We wanted to have a chance just to make, I got asked if I would make a couple of reflections outside of the EU and the OECD, but obviously these reflections clearly reflect, I think, what is a common pattern. And I think obviously the broader mission that here is that it appears that there is a broad-based global recognition that ultimately economies suffer when you leave people out. So whether you're doing this because, as Lamia said, the entrepreneurs or the aspiring or nascent entrepreneurs need us, or whether you're doing it because you've got an economic case and we need them, it's clearly not an area where there is disagreement on the importance. Allow me, if I can, to just mention that, I think what's also fueling this is whether in the United States, the Black Lives Matter movement, or whether the awareness of the importance of some of the parts of our society overall is really helping to fuel an awareness of removing barriers to entrepreneurship. And I would agree with the comment made earlier that ultimately, I think the pandemic has a silver lining in this regard. It has however, opened up an awareness that the pandemic hit excluded groups harder than most. In fact, in a recent survey that the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation did here in the United States, which is a significant thought leader, as you know, in this space, we found that 41% of Black Kansas Cityans would not be able to cover a $400 emergency expense. And at GEN, we've looked at these numbers across certainly the United States and found that they reflect similar national averages. And I think when these kinds of inequities reach these levels, we all lose. So even if you're winning, and I would point out that GEN is proud to have launched with Startup Genome our global startup ecosystem report that shows very, very optimistic numbers across the world in terms of numbers of new starts, in terms of numbers of scalable firms, the size of ecosystems, the outputs of ecosystems in terms of total economic value is skyrocketed in the last in 2020 and 2021. But even if you're in that winning situation, the foundations of our entrepreneurial ecosystems grow weaker. And so I think the great thing about entrepreneurship is it remains one of the greatest ways to empower excluded groups, historically underrepresented groups. And obviously, it's great that the EU and the OECD and organizations like GEN and the Kauffman Foundation are deep into some of the actions to work on this. So I think one of the expressions that we use of this, I'm going to give a couple of perspectives from the United States, is inclusive prosperity. So, which starts with the notion that, you know, the economy is not a zero-sum game, that if you enable some people to do better, it doesn't mean that others have to do worse. And the notion here is one of regeneration. It's one of the generate positive ripples, multiplier effects everywhere. And so I think we also recognize, of course, all of us as policymakers, something that, you know, has been a mainstay of the work that we at GEN and the Kauffman Foundation have advocated over the years, namely that almost all net new jobs in most economies now come from firms less than 5 years old. And so the notion that when more people do better, demand increases, which lifts all businesses and indeed the people that work in them. So it's not just about creating jobs, it's of course around creating economic opportunity that for people who were previously left out of that story. It naturally creates a bigger tax base, it naturally provides more funding for communities. So I think we still see disturbing gaps. I mean, I think the disturbing gaps that most worry me have always been the ones that are sort of underneath. That, you know, that we've seen a flatlining of new starts over the last 40 years, but these gaps are most evident, as I think this report most importantly emphasizes, in some of the groups that have been historically underrepresented. In a lot of the markets, so I'll just give the United States as an example, just by as a comparison, it tends to be, the historical groups tend to be, for example, Black and brown entrepreneurs. They tended to have the least personal capital, the worst borrowing ability to get their companies off the ground or poised for growth. And naturally, I think as we always admired the work of OECD and frankly, Lamia in particular, for helping us to really dig deep into understanding the current trend in the United States also around why women are only half as likely as men to start a business. And the trouble with some of these companies that do start in the groups that we are talking about, in these entrepreneurs in the missing middle, the missing entrepreneurs, is that often they tend to begin small and stay small. And so it's one of the reasons that we authored, John Deary, who's on our executive committee, just authored a piece a few days ago about some of the reasons why and some of the solutions certainly in the US that we could do to try to get more, for example, Black investors investing in Black entrepreneurs, more women investors investing in women entrepreneurs. And I'll put a link to that in the chat. So this is very exciting. I think many of the speakers have advanced the case. We want to move on to the panel discussion about some of the specifics. I will add to the excitement of just imagine the growth that can be unleashed if we get more of these historically underrepresented groups into the equation. It's delightful to see that there's great recognition, that there's talent and intellectual capacity going into working out specific policy steps that we can take. At GEN, we have our GEN Atlas. If you're not familiar with that, you can go to our genglobal.org website, where we track not just the great work being done by the OECD and the EU, but many of the governments around the world that are, as I think both the speakers mentioned previously, deploying experiments to figure out what works and what doesn't in removing some of these barriers. And so we're very proud to join to contribute that as part of a list of resources that I know have been mentioned earlier about how governments can develop a smart policy toolbox in trying to address some of these innovative solutions, to come up with innovative solutions to some of these complex challenges. Finally, I mentioned also on a very practical level, we would just love to, make a point of participating in the events you mentioned in December. I think also we'll reference the fact that the Global Entrepreneurship Network will, after a 2-year hiatus during the pandemic, will reconvene the Global Entrepreneurship Congress from March 27th to 30th in 2022. And during that, we will have a ministerial where we expect to have not just ministers, but we also have our Startup Nation Summit, which is for policymakers and staff to come together and to work on many of the issues that this report has highlighted in terms of looking at what solutions are being tested in different markets and economies and what are the results that they're achieving. And I think this is often where the rubber hits the road. We can identify the problems, as Joost says, raise the awareness, but then we have to test some of the solutions. And at GEN, we're very much about the notion that we need to help policymakers, just like the OECD does and just like the EU does, share their experiments, given that they have a common mission and a common purpose. And I hope anybody who's interested, whether live or virtually, will be welcome to join that Congress and indeed the policy-making days and components addressing these issues in the future. So with that, I hope optimistic note, and thanks to the extraordinary leadership of the OECD and the EU, we want to say, I'll turn back over to get the panel off and running. And on behalf of GEN, thank you so much for joining today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Next up, we have David Hamiliski of the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, one of the project report authors, who will be taking us through the rest of the session. David, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on where you are. We'd like to thank you for joining us. We're really excited that you were able to be here today to talk about these important issues. We're going to move into a roundtable discussion in a few minutes, and we would encourage you to be active and participate. You can pose questions in the chat or using the Q&A function. You can add to the discussion with your thoughts in the chat. And to get that spirit going, we've got a little quiz for everybody to do. It's just really short. We want to get the juices flowing. So Matt, could you please put the quiz up for everybody? We've got 3 questions that ask about barriers, government actions, and priorities going forward. And so you can pick one answer for each question, and we'll leave it open for a few minutes to take a quick pulse of the participants. So the first question, what is the greatest barrier to opening up entrepreneurship for all? Lack of awareness across the population, institutional conditions, which means attitudes in society or the institutional and welfare systems, obstacles to finance, skills barriers, or small networks. Second question, where should governments focus their efforts to make entrepreneurship more inclusive? So should we promote a culture of entrepreneurship, increase the supply of finance, boost skills, including financial literacy, help people build entrepreneurship networks, address bias in institutional conditions and support system, or do we scale up all of the support for inclusive entrepreneurship? The last question tries to look at new developments and new opportunities that governments have. And so the question is, which of the following has the greatest potential to increase inclusion in entrepreneurship? The choices are innovations in finance, such as fintech, growth in digital entrepreneurship, peer learning, leveraging partnerships with non-government actors, and the last option is to increase diversity in policymaking. So we hope you've all had a chance to respond. And Matt, how does it look? Do we have responses that we can see?
Yeah, we're about 50% of responses. So let's close that now. If you haven't completed, apologies, but let's get the results up.
So question number one, we see institutional conditions is the leader, followed closely by finance and awareness. Number two, again, institutional conditions and bias in the ecosystem, followed by skills. And the last one is spread fairly evenly, but leveraging partnerships seems to be the most popular. Well, this is great. We'd like to thank all of you for these quick reactions. And we're going to move into a roundtable discussion where we pick up on some of these points now. We're extremely lucky to have three special guests with us today. They are each an entrepreneur, and they also are very active in supporting other entrepreneurs. We have from Ireland, Paula Fitzsimons, who operates several initiatives to support women entrepreneurs, returning immigrant entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in rural areas. These are Going for Growth, Acorns, Back for Business, extremely successful initiatives, award-winning initiatives, and we're very happy that Paula is able to join us today. I'd like to also introduce Jacqueline Winstanley from the UK. And like Paula, Jacqueline is herself an entrepreneur and runs several initiatives to help support other entrepreneurs, but also advocate to government about the needs in some of these target groups that we're talking about. Some of her projects include Universal Inclusion, Fluidity UK, and the Inclusive Entrepreneur. Welcome, Jacqueline. We're extremely happy to have you. And finally, but definitely not least, is Ahmad Sufyan Bairam. He is an award-winning entrepreneur and author, and a lot of his work focuses on supporting people from areas of conflict and fragile societies and helping to get them on their feet through entrepreneurship. He works at Techstars, which is a global platform for investors in innovation, and he's the manager for the Middle East and Africa. And so he's very involved in refugee entrepreneurship. And we're extremely happy that you could join us today, Ahmad. So as I said, we've got some questions for our guests today, but I encourage all of the participants to be active in the chat, contribute questions, and we'll pick them up as we go. So I'm going to start with Paula. Now, Paula, we've known each other for many years. We talk quite often. And I recall not that long ago, you were telling me that you ran into a mantra that was nobody left behind. Could you tell us why that spoke to you and how it comes out in your work?
Absolutely, no problem about that at all. I think when one just talks about entrepreneurship and doesn't break it down, then people can get left behind. So to me, I like to think it's about men and women, regardless of age, whether they were born in the country or have returned to the country, whether they live in urban or rural environments, because that's one that you've left out, actually, I think, because often those in rural environments are more disadvantaged. But it's interesting because I have found over time that when you focus on one of these groups, so I mean, a great amount of talk is about women today, for example. So we have two different ones for women that attract two different types of women. So we have Going for Growth, because one of your previous speakers talked about the fact that it isn't just about starting, but it's trying to encourage some of these missing entrepreneurs also to grow. And the idea there is to nurture ambition among women and support them to realize their growth aspirations. And then Acorns is looking very much at the rural area and tapping into the rural potential or the entrepreneurial potential of women in rural areas. But each of those, you know, when you break it down, men and women, regardless of age, each will have different pinch points. And when you're tailoring a program, you have to bear those in mind. So a concrete example, those returning from overseas, their pinch point is that their networks have broken down. So they don't have well-developed networks. A woman in rural Ireland is very isolated. So you work on building the network for her. So while we absolutely believe in the peer support, and I saw that was one of your questions, but we would also tailor for the particular group. And that's why I think it's important, if you don't want to leave anyone behind, you tailor initiatives specifically for that demographic group.
That's great, Paula. I want to shift a little bit now and turn to Jacqueline. We've heard periodically throughout the event today about COVID. And I wanted to ask you what you've seen in your work. I mean, COVID has definitely been a difficult context for many people, but have you seen the other side of that as well?
Yes, so obviously we've heard today that there are already existing inequalities, and what the pandemic did was to intensify that, and most notably for disabled people, and particularly those from the deaf community. So the initial response from our sector was of devastation. It was of fear and of loss of everything that they'd fought for, and particularly a voice. They felt invisible, they felt silenced and left behind, particularly in terms of government responses around the business disruption and the health and wellbeing side of the pandemic. They experienced lack of access to social care, essential for disabled entrepreneurs. However, this sector is notoriously resilient. We have to be. For those who had access to effective networks and the tools and skills required to operate in the virtual world, the pandemic brought about untold opportunities. Within a world where reasonable adjustments suddenly apply to the whole of society. And for the network, the decision to place our network on the virtual world platform by the end of the first week of the pandemic ensured that our sector had a voice, the necessary sector-specific business support, marketplace, health and wellbeing programs, research, etc., and importantly, making recommendations to government. Those recommendations led to the creation of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Inclusive Entrepreneurship and its subsequent ambitious and impactful 2-year programme of work. For our members, for our disabled entrepreneurs that we work with, myself included, they didn't only retain their businesses, they flourished. And in some cases, they created additional businesses. Some saw their businesses grow in ways they never expected. For example, Ability Today, which is an academy that trains disabled people to become journalists. At the start of the pandemic was just to start their new course and felt it was over. They wouldn't be able to proceed. But putting everything online, they proceeded with their course and they had inputs that they'd never expected. And our network is filled with examples like that. But I want to just emphasize, although we've seen this massive resilience and growth, those inequalities have not gone away. So there's still a lot of work to do. But it's a really good example of within the pandemic, how people did rise above the difficulties that we're facing, particularly in the lockdown, and went on to create such innovation, which was wonderful. As Secretariat, our role led to a greater understanding within the Palace of Westminster, and it's recognised for placing inclusive entrepreneurship at the forefront of policy in the UK and internationally. It opened a whole vista of opportunities for disabled entrepreneurs everywhere and led to some positive responses from government and partners, particularly things like during the pandemic, our entrepreneurs and before are reliant upon a thing called the Access to Work Award to get their practical support, without which they cannot continue to operate in the area of creating enterprise. The APPG allowed us to inform government on what that meant for our entrepreneurs and government waived that criteria, the tax year associated with the pandemic. So we've seen both. We did see initial devastation and fear, but we've actually seen incredible innovation and enterprise and inclusive economic growth.
Thanks, Jacqueline. That's great. A message of resilience helps to put a slightly more positive light on the difficult context we've had for the past 2 years. And again, you highlighted networks, which is a point that Paula raised. I want to turn to Ahmad now and ask Ahmad about finance. Finance is, of course, one of the greatest hurdles that all entrepreneurs face. And of course, many of the people that we're talking about today, people from groups that are disadvantaged and underrepresented in entrepreneurship, face even greater difficulties accessing finance. Could you tell us a little bit about these challenges, and in particular with the refugee entrepreneurs that you work with? And did anything change during COVID in this respect?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, David. So recently, similar to the poll that we did today, we asked a question to more than 270 Syrian businesses that are located in neighboring country to Syria. And we asked them what the challenges and barriers that prevent them from accessing and scaling their business and grow. And 9 out of 10 of those businesses consider access to finance resources as extremely challenging for many of the businesses. Just to give a little bit background, why always access to finance is very much a struggle for many of the refugees, entrepreneurs and startups. And that because not the shortage of the money, but the limited access to that money. If we consider, I've been studying the challenges that facing Syrian refugees or refugees in general, entrepreneurs challenges, and those challenges can be split into 2 groups. To make it more simple, we have like external group, which is right to work, obtaining bank accounts where they can have to, the asylum process if they don't have their documents and their ID, the movement limitation, etc. Those are external. The refugees entrepreneurs cannot really do anything other than waiting for bureaucracies and laws to be changed in that sense. The other things, the other group, which is more internal, for them to understand the language, the culture, especially if they move to a country with a new environment like Syrian moving to Europe, overcome the trauma, the physical, social, the unfamiliar business environment, how they can deal with the new customers in the new country, and how they can build the network. So those combined, if we merge those together, access to finance is one of the things that they needed both to be solved. As an entrepreneur, I would not be able to access to that money from an angel investors or a legit investment organization like a venture capital unless I have registered my company. So I have a right to access, I have my bank account. I am also be able to understand the market, what's the opportunity there, be able to speak to my customer language, etc. So those really made it a very much complicated situation for many of the refugees to be able to chuckle and focus on both. To be able to overcome this, many of them start to shift from be able to rely on those constitutional investments to rely on their own bootstrapping. On average, on the study group that we focus on, this has led to for them to wait more than 9 months on average before they launch their products. This is what many of their businesses in a risk to be an absolute or just to give up an idea within the struggle to having sustainable life in their situation. So that's kind of that's kind of understanding made it a great challenge for many of the people to be able to tackle those particular challenge for the access to financing.
Great, thanks, Ahmad. We've put the links for the book into the chat, also the links for the Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool. I can see some comments and other links being inserted. I encourage anyone who has a question to please insert the question in the chat or the Q&A. I'm going to continue the discussion. I mean, Ahmad, you were highlighting some of the challenges that refugees face in accessing finance, and some of these challenges are common to other groups as well. I want to turn back to Jacqueline because there's another side to this story as well, in that we can talk about demand side issues, but there's also supply side issues. And I know you've been working in this area. So why don't you tell us about what you're doing and what some of the solutions could be on the supply side of the financial market?
Yes, so it's obviously one of the key things whenever you talk to an entrepreneur anywhere really, one of the first things is difficulty accessing finance. And for the disabled entrepreneur, that's threefold. And it's very much sort of, we like to say it's the last bastion in terms of the financial sector looking at inequalities, because, you know, I think it's pretty accepted that they've looked at things around women in enterprise, and not my term, but BAME in enterprise, and disability is the last thing possible they're going to start looking at, and possibly the most difficult for them in terms of perceptions, actually thinking about a disabled person running a business. So within the network, and also within the work we started in the APPG in the pandemic, we've looked at this in some detail. And we did, obviously, and we are collaborating with banks, we're collaborating with organisations such as Innovate UK, with accelerator programmes, etc. They're all just starting to look at this issue, and it will take time. So one of the things we've also started to look at, as well as kind of bringing about good practice in those sectors, is actually the regulation of those sectors. So we've been working with the Lending Standards Board. So that in essence, what we're trying to do is help them to put in some really sound guidance and advice for the financial institutions on how they can engage entrepreneurs who we would say just do business differently. So if we think of the kind of hurdles that our members and the sector face, it's not just the traditional lack of access to finance. It's actually not having, it's that sort of generational lack of education, experience, and having a good credit rating to be able to access finance at any level. So sometimes, no matter what program would be put into place, our entrepreneurs would fall off the first rung of the ladder. So what we're trying to do, in partnership with the organisations themselves and the Lending Standards Board, is try to put something in place that can maybe change the dynamic on this, that do the criteria that's been sort of set in stone for so many years. Is that appropriate criteria anymore when you're establishing whether somebody's suitable to obtain finance? We're also working with the accelerator programs, trying to, some of them are really good, some of them are doing some really good work in terms of entrepreneurship for not just disabled entrepreneurs, but other, what we would say in the UK, people that have protected characteristics, but also wanting to work with investors, angel investors, etc. And what we're starting to see is a shift in them, maybe accepting that they need to do things a little bit differently as well to support entrepreneurs in this sector, and not just be looking at return, but actually looking at the socioeconomic impact of them investing in a very positive way.
Great, thank you, Jacqueline. I took a few points away from what you were talking about. I think I could summarize it by a single word, which is connections. You highlighted connections between finance, institutional environment, and skills. And when you have challenges in one area, they're all interrelated to challenges in other areas. And I think that's really important to underline. And I want to pick up on this point with Ahmad, because there are various innovations ongoing right now in policy, and we have new solutions appearing. One area is finance. We see the emergence of fintech, and this holds potential for possibly closing some of these gaps. But I think we also have to acknowledge that there is a risk that it might be just a new barrier. It might make it more difficult to access finance. And I want to see what you thought about that, and how do we ensure that some of these new solutions can actually help the entrepreneurs that we're talking about. And it might include other issues such as skills gaps, for example, when we're thinking about fintech.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good question. I would say that we currently live in an area that is very much important to change what we have. It's not just for the access for the finance, but in many aspects in terms of the response that we have for the refugees crisis. Let's take one step back, and probably some will disagree. For my opinion, is that refugees crisis response has never been yet disrupted. We've been doing the same approach when we have a refugees crisis, where we support financially humanitarian aid and then do personal development. Nonetheless, there will be many deep of atmosphere of untrust that created due to the bureaucracy, miscommunication, sometimes fraud and use of refugees to contribute to that, just to name some. Currently, I think now it's the best time to change all of this using the new technologies that we've started to see emerging in the world, whether it's the blockchain, the Web3, the decentralized automated organization, the DOA, whatever you want to call it. So those kind of technology is not the main purpose of it. The goal here is technology is not to sort and distribute data, rather than to ensure that all the distributed parties within the network that never been trusted each other before are completely agreed with each other. So the main elements that always we've been talking about and Jacqueline mentioned is the trust and the building of the network. This is a new technology help us to enable many of those technologies. Nowadays, refugees who probably been in Syria, moved to Lebanon, be able to, using her phone, to access freelance work, be able to work and deliver some jobs and receive money through Bitcoins immediately, directly, without needing for any approval or any access of limitations and barriers. Same process, if you're going to do it without those technologies, you have to go through longer process of asylum that's needed to be approval, to take your identity, a new identity, pick it up, be able to go to bank accounts, open a bank account, understanding the bureaucracy that's required there, and maybe would be in a different language that you need to learn, and then be able to access the work. A process that I witnessed probably in countries like Germany could take for more than 1 year. Now it's happening within a few seconds that be able to access. We heard about the new technologies that are helping refugees having a digital identity as well, that will help them later on to access to financial investment for angel investors. Without the use of the technologies, we start to see a lot of unconscious bias from the angel investors and the agent networks that Jacqueline also was talking about, due to the fact that they have a lot of pressure to invest in the startups without legal registration, for example, also without being able to do very much heavily due diligence. And in those situations for underrepresented community with a complicated situation, it becomes very much hard. So for them, passing on this deal is much easier than to say yes. So this is what we hope to be able to disrupt this kind of sense that we currently have, to be able to use this kind of technologies to build on and be able to assure there is a trust, systematic trust within the atmosphere of our response in the financial way, but also beyond that as well.
Thanks, Ahmad. I think that the trust point is really important. We see that in a lot of the interventions, in that they can often be more effective and more attractive to the people that we are targeting if it relies on some form of trust, perhaps a pre-established trust if you're engaging other actors in the community. Now, I've been keeping my eye on the chat and on the Q&A, and I've seen questions come in. So I'm going to throw some of them out now. So I hope the three of you are on your toes. Let's start with Paula. We had a question from Tom Cooney, and we know Tom is in Ireland. So he asks, should governments introduce dedicated national inclusive entrepreneurship strategies to help give direction to support initiatives? Paula, what do you think? You're on mute, Paula. Paula?
I was muted because I have a bad cold, and I apologize, Ahmad. I didn't mean to be sneezing in the middle of your talk, which I found fascinating. It's really an interesting question. I found that I'm learning so much from listening to both Jacqueline and Ahmad, because they're areas that I haven't been exposed to. And yes, you know, I think I work in the area of inclusive entrepreneurship. And I suppose in a way it becomes then, what do you mean by inclusive, you know? And because my focus has been slightly different. Now, I would think in many respects, looking at Tom's question, I don't think we always have to look for government to introduce policies and different strategies, because I work in the private sector and I'm supported by government and also supported by the private sector to do what I do. And basically what we do is we harness the volunteer and the willingness to give back of successful entrepreneurs. And I think that that model works extremely well. And you don't need the government to be suggesting what needs to be done, because the situation that you're looking at, Ahmad, is quite different to the situation that I'm looking at. So I tend to focus on females and age. I've done senior, haven't done youth. But I take your point about remembering, Jacqueline, not to leave anyone behind, and those who have, disabilities. And I didn't include them on my list simply because I didn't just think of it. So I think one of the really important things that this is doing is it's raising awareness above what we would normally think of, right? So you think you're being really inclusive, right? And you think you've included everybody and you have your arms around everybody. And then you realize, oh gosh, I didn't think of refugees. I didn't think of people with disabilities. And maybe Tom's right. Maybe we should make sure that we think of it.
Jacqueline, do you have a reaction to that? Do we need national strategies?
Yes, I do. And I'm probably going to say that answer with the work that I do. And I've utilised that role, that sort of way of working through all of my work to date, because I do think it's essential. But in that process, it has to be led by the people who are effectively the entrepreneurs and who are facing the barriers. And we're quite lucky in the UK that, again, through the network and the APPG that work was done last year, that we are engaging with government. So government are working with us. They're very, they're listening and they're collaborating in how that strategy will look like going forward. They're creating at the moment an enterprise strategy, and it's the voice of the entrepreneurs and their lived experiences that are underpinning that work going forward. And just to sort of emphasize on this, because when you are looking at reducing inequality, you can't do it in isolation. There are so many other aspects of, my mantra is, if you will, increasing equality of access to life's opportunities. You don't just do entrepreneurship in isolation from everything else. And lots of other government departments underpin that as well. So for me, it's essential, because that way we'll get a coordinated response. You can't suddenly sort of say, oh, well, the entrepreneur can have finance, but they can't have the appropriate health and social care that they need without having that government. And it's not a dictated role. It's a partnership, collaborative role on how they can best support and upscale the sector.
I think that's a really important point, because one of the things I wanted to highlight in our discussion today is that this is about people. It's about people's lives. And we've heard throughout the discussion today some really big numbers, 35 million. We've heard about some great big initiatives, but this is all about people and helping people explore opportunities that they want to explore. And I really want to underline that. So I thank you for that, Jacqueline. We have time for just a couple of quick questions. Ahmad, there was one for you in the chat. So just briefly, how can we address unconscious bias and structural discrimination, which must be tackled alongside policy initiatives if we're going to have positive outcomes?
Yeah, very good question. Good timing, because recently published an article talking about the unconscious bias for refugees accessing financing. It's on my personal blog. I'm happy to share it in the chat. Just to give a little bit very quick background, what would you mean by unconscious bias and that words? So technically, I've met a lot of refugees. For example, to give a story, for a guy who's living in Germany, he missed very much important meeting with a high-profile investors just because he was worried about his family back home that he lost contact with for a week or so. Turned out to be nothing danger that happened to them. They just lost electricity in that area, and he was very much concerned. Later, the deal was cancelled because the venture capital considered this his worried and not be able to meet in the meeting as a sign for not being able to manage a business in a proper way. We also heard about some entrepreneurs who goes to reach out to the investors based on Jordan, who rejected them to invest in them just because they have another full-time job. Just to know that refugees cannot be able to stay in Jordan if they're not asylum seeker or they've been approved by UNHCR or they have a full-time job. So the entrepreneurs would like to make sure that there is initial approval first from the venture capital to quit the job and pursue their dreams to create their startups. rather than like, this is more of misunderstanding that created unconsciously toward biasing and missing some of the deals that are coming from refugees community or pass by it in that sense. I think there's a lot of that have to be in education. We also heard about Jonathan intervention of talking about how in the US, mostly Black venture capital, Black VCs and angel investors start to invest more specifically in the Black founders. Similar initiative could be done as well by relying on diaspora communities to invest in refugees that basically in the same community they try to understand, or the previous people who came 5 years ago to be able to invest in the newcomers because they also understand their situation. So it's mostly, I would say, education, be able to rely on this network of diasporas people as well. Also, the article, you will find more information on that.
Great, thanks, Ahmad. While our time has essentially run out, we've got time for one last quick question, which I'm going to put to Paula. We've talked a lot about challenges faced. We've talked a lot about solutions. I want to look into the crystal ball and look to the future. We've had the COVID context. Everything has changed. What have been some of the big changes and how do we go forward?
Okay, no small question there. Well, I think to a certain extent, we have rehearsed, as it were, the negatives with regard to COVID. And Jacqueline referred earlier to, you know, some positives that have come out of it. And many of these are related, I think, to digitalization and e-commerce. Because for many of your missing entrepreneurs, it can make it easier to access the market because location and mobility becomes less important. Let me give you, can I tell you a story, David? Because I think stories help to illustrate the point. So to take a woman who was teaching in primary school, to young children, and she was teaching them foreign languages after school. Okay, and of course she could only do it in a 20-mile area of where she lived, and it was her in front of the class. Then COVID came, she lost her schools, she lost her customers. What was she going to do? And she was in a round table group where the entrepreneurs were supporting each other, and they were saying, go online, practice with our children, and please teach them Irish. And that woman, Sinead McKeever's her name, Little Lingua, is actually teaching Irish to customers or to clients or students in America, you know, all over the world who want to. Now, she would never have thought of that. She would have been much more locally focused. And the opportunity for delivering personal services digitally for smaller companies who need less money to sell through e-commerce, they get direct access to their customers. I think there's going to be enormous changes coming from COVID, and they're not all negative.
Well, thank you for that, Paula. It's good to end on a positive note. This has been a fascinating discussion. It's great to hear each of your different perspectives. So I'd like to thank you, Paula, Jacqueline, and Ahmad for your contributions today. We're going to end the roundtable here. Now, I've put the links in the chat. I'm going to put them back in again to the report. The report is out now, Missing Entrepreneurs 2021. I encourage you to go look at it. It's got data that compares activity rates and barriers across countries. It's got policy chapters, policy advice, special focus on microfinance, another special focus on immigrant entrepreneurship. We've got country notes with details on what's happening on each country. Please go look at it, OECD-EU Missing Entrepreneurs 2021. And now we're going to turn the floor over to Dr. Jonathan Potter, Head of Entrepreneurship Policy and Analysis Unit in the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, for some final thoughts. Over to you, John.
Well, thank you very much, David. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to all the participants. It's really been fascinating. Thanks to everybody for coming to this event. Of course, we're very happy that this important publication is now out. And that is thanks to the collaboration between the OECD and the European Commission, and to the inputs of all the different stakeholders who've been involved from the world of policy and from the world of research. Thanks to everybody. The Missing Entrepreneurs 2021, the idea is that this will be a reference document for everyone who's looking for information on entrepreneurship activities and policies by different social groups. And that information was missing in the past, but it's here now with the Missing Entrepreneurs series. And also do be aware that there's a lot of other material as well. We have the online Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool. That's a self-assessment tool for policymakers. We have about 15 thematic policy briefs. We have country inclusive entrepreneurship policy assessments every other year. And these are all things that OECD's been able to put together with the support of the European Union in collaboration. So thanks for all that. And in closing, I would just like to point again back to some of the headlines from the report and from what we've been saying today. And so the main thing is that millions of entrepreneurs are missing. And we've heard this. There could be 9 million additional entrepreneurs in the EU. There could be 35 million additional entrepreneurs in the OECD if everyone was as active in starting a new business as men aged 30 to 49. Women are more likely to be missing entrepreneurs than any other group, but there are many key gaps among youth, seniors, immigrants, and refugees and disabled that we've been talking about here, and other groups as well. The picture's not the same across all countries, and the report tells us about some of the differences. Countries like the Netherlands and Ireland have relatively fewer missing entrepreneurs. The biggest gaps are in countries like Austria, Finland, and Italy. There are therefore important lessons to be shared across countries. But clearly we need to address the barriers that are faced by potential entrepreneurs who are being blocked. And the report tells us where to look. Major sticking points are access to finance, skills gaps, lack of networks. For example, only 38% of women say they have the necessary entrepreneurship skills in the EU, relative to more than half of men. And there are barriers in attitudes and barriers in institutions in wider society. And the poll where you all contributed really brought that out. Also, we heard in the panel from Jacqueline and Ahmad about how people with disabilities and refugees, they face challenges in accessing finance because of how they are perceived. And then the standard entrepreneurship support programs contain bias in themselves against some of the entrepreneurs who we need, particularly when they favor startups in certain sectors that are perceived as having growth potential. So governments have many tools to address the barriers, and they are already doing a lot. And you'll see that in the report, in the country profiles at the end. Many governments have developed dedicated and tailored schemes for inclusion in entrepreneurship. Some examples: entrepreneurship coaching offered in different languages to immigrant and minority groups in Denmark. Peer learning for women entrepreneurship in Ireland, and the bridging allowance in Germany that helps people to transition from unemployment to self-employment, retaining some of their welfare support. And these types of schemes, they need to be adopted much more widely. There's great scope for that in COVID-19 recovery packages, in national and subnational government funding programs, in the European structural and investment funds. There's scope to develop appropriate interventions, but we need people to conceive of these interventions and to propose them and to get them funded. We trust the report will make the importance of inclusive entrepreneurship policies clear. It'll provide inspiration on how to develop the right initiatives. The report's available. We've been putting it into the link, please have a look. Have a look as well at the OECD EU Better Entrepreneurship Policy Tool online. Thanks for joining us, and have a great rest of the day. Stay in touch. All the best. I think we close the event here.